everyone, and thanks for joining me. My name is Elisa Kerr, and I'm the Partnership Liaison for the National Institute for Direct Instruction. Today, we're celebrating 50 years of corrective reading. In 1975, corrective reading was published, and since then, it's made a lasting impact on students who need reading support the most. Today, I am excited and honored to meet with co-author Linda Carnine to reflect on the journey and hear directly from her, her insights and stories on corrective reading. Linda, thanks for being here today. Can we start by having you introduce yourself and just share your affiliation with direct instruction?
Thank you. Yes, my name is Linda Carnine, and I have been involved in direct instruction much longer than many of you people are even alive. So that's always embarrassing. But I was an undergraduate in Oregon. I was born in Idaho, and after finishing, I was a German teacher, and I got secondary ed certification, was teaching, as well as, a lot of involvement in psychology and some other things. So I went to the University of Illinois on a doctoral fellowship for the classroom learning. And I got there and was in the psychology department taking a lot of classes and found they weren't really talking about what I was interested in. At that time, in my doctoral program was a brilliant woman, Jessica Daniel, who became the first Black APA president, by the way. Amazing woman. And she said, you might be interested in seeing what's going on over at this Colonel Wolfe preschool in Champaign, because there's a really fascinating pair of people, Siegfried Engelmann and Carl Bereiter, who are working to teach kids who really have not a lot of great background in it, with their disadvantages, what we said then. They probably came from poor backgrounds and had not a lot of early language development and so on. And they're doing some exciting things. So I went over and visited, and I was really impressed. It was not what I went to graduate school for. I was much more interested in the psychology of secondary language acquisition, but I was absolutely intrigued. And I was staying around and suddenly checking out this preschool classroom. I thought there was a janitor coming in, and he had a black t-shirt and cigarettes in his cuff and stuff. And he started, I thought, oh, well, okay. I thought it was, like I said, just the janitor, and he was awfully friendly. And I was alone at that time, and I thought I'd probably need to scoot toward the door, not knowing who he was. And it turned out, I said, well, finally, who are you? And he said, well, I'm Zig Engelman. And he
Oh, wow.
started in great big muscles. And I thought, But he was there, working on the preschool, and he was so fascinating. So right off the bat, I started taking classes with him, and we would do story writing and doing things that I'd never thought I'd do with preschool children. And then I'm teaching in the preschool, and it was fascinating. But I was also doing a lot of other graduate work, and Zig at that point was confronted, because he was, and I realized it right off the bat, an absolute genius. I'd never been around a genius, but he was a genius. And he had decided he didn't want to get a doctorate. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. And his passion was to develop curriculum that would allow all students to be successful. And he had worked with this Carl Breiter, and they'd been doing this program for disadvantaged students, which was the basis of all the DISTAR, direct instruction for teaching reading language, language. What the language wasn't in there, reading math. Carl was leaving, and Carl was basically Zig's sponsor, because you had to have a PhD at the university in order to run a total program. So at that point, Zig was needing to have another sponsor. And Gina Osborne also didn't have a doctorate, who was the one doing all the language program with him, nor did Cookie Bruner. But Jean got in touch with Wes Becker, who was another very, very incredibly bright scientist there. And he came from the psychology department with more of a background in management, parent teaching, the whole psychology of reinforcement theories and so on. And he came along and met Ziggy and said he was intrigued with what he was doing. He would be a sponsor. And it was at that time that they had the opportunity to participate in the Follow Through Project, which was very early, like 69, 68. And that was studying all the different approaches to early childhood education. So Wes and Ziggy um, paired up and became the co-directors of the Follow Through Project, and I was a part of that. But what was really so powerful about Ziggy was his, like I said, his genius analysis of all the components. And now we're hearing a lot about the you know Emily Hanford's uh,
Science of reading.
the science of reading and so on. Ziggy identified all of the elements in the science of reading 55 years ago, 58. So, what happened in terms of corrective reading, and I'll just share this. I was working in a lot of the schools in our follow through program. We had about 20 places. And Gary Davis, another gentleman who came from Providence, Rhode Island, we were both project managers. So I went to um, the Indian Reservation, Lakota Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. I went to Washington, D.C., Anacostia, New York City, but mostly Tupelo, Mississippi, where there were all Black segregated schools. And then I went to Flippin, Arkansas, where it was all poor white. Had a variety of places I consulted, and also managed. But my main place was Cherokee, North Carolina. And Cherokee, this was the eastern band of the Cherokees. The rest had been, driven out to Oklahoma. And it was a beautiful place where kids, typically did not get a lot of English. And they had some Cherokee. They were learning some Cherokee, but they just didn't have a lot of strong BIE instruction. And I would say that the teachers teaching the BIE were in the BIE weren't wonderfully enthusiastic about teaching these children either. So Wes and I had gone to Cherokee for a visit, and it was in the early 70s. I think it was about 72, 73. We came back after being profoundly influenced by a parent meeting. The parents had the program in the school for 2 to 3 years, and they were seeing the incredible progress their younger children were making. They had learned how to read. And in fact, that's what I did my dissertation with. And they were reading very well. Their comprehension was great. But their older children were not able to read. They hadn't had direct instruction. And the parents came to this meeting and demanded, we need something. You got to do something for these older kids. Our kids all need the right opportunities in school. And our older kids have failed. Our younger ones are doing beautifully. Fix it. And so
Wow.
Wes and I came back from that really profound meeting and said, Zig, we need to talk. Next day, we sat down with Ziggy, told him what had happened. And he said, I know. That's we can't do it. He said, no, working with struggling readers is so different and so much harder than working with initial learning students.
Mhm.
We need, they need so much more practice. They have so much discouraged, approach to everything because they failed for so long. They got bad habits. Because they've been taught how to just look at the first sound or whatever, guess at words. They got such guessing habits. It's just too hard. We can't do that. Oh, so we worked and worked on Ziggy. Oh, kind of filed him down. And he said,
Yeah.
okay, we'll do it. And that's what started the whole program. But his analysis, like with everything, I've never been with a genius, but his analysis of everything was based on what he learned from mistakes, what they had trouble with, what were their challenges. he was incredible. He never learned a foreign language, but he could teach English to anyone with a foreign language because he knew what the problems were when they were learning English. He could analyze anything. And his understanding of these, what he used to call kids, they've just been stripped down to the loincloth. They've had so much failure over and over. That was what made the corrective reading so powerful. For me, what surprised me, first of all, no one, it isn't apparent from all the published materials, but what Ziggy wanted to try to do initially was just teach them with stories and have them learn to read stories without errors, because everything that they'd had up to that point had taught them guessing strategies, and so everything he did in stories was set up to punish guessing. I mean, every sentence, everything was set in a way that if you guessed, you're going to get it wrong. And it was very apparent very soon. Basically, we tried to start out with a group of middle school students here in Eugene. They, weren't particularly kids of color. They just had a lot of failure. And they're pretty angry. They were rough kids. That was the toughest group I've ever taught in my life. They were so turned off. And we would take a story and we give it to them. And then every day I would come back after teaching the group and we'd analyze their errors. And it was astounding how they made the same errors over and over again. They'd mix up words like when, then, and who, what, who and how, what, that. Easy words, but they would be concentrating on some of the harder words and they just mix up all these words. So anything that they had difficulty with, we really put in the practice. So in direct instruction, everything is explicitly taught. And when it's introduced, it is cumulatively reviewed. So if I've taught you one thing, you're going to have to remember it because it's going to come back over and over and over again. And that's how we built in everything that they had trouble with. So they always had to say, then we had to go through all the phonics elements they didn't know. And the pronunciation, which is the phonemic awareness that these students didn't have. All that was built in, and a lot of focus on vowels because that's what they missed most of the time. So everything that we worked on, they would have a lot of practice, but then they keep making the same errors. So we'd have those really tough words reappear at a high frequency in the stories. So the lesson evolved to be the word attack skills at the beginning that gave them a focus, because initially we didn't try that, then we needed it. And then we introduced every new phonics element they didn't have. And for instance, very early, they didn't know sound. They didn't know the vowels. They didn't know short and long vowels. So we started out with primarily short vowels, except we really needed the long vowel of E because you couldn't write a story about anything with that he, she, we, and so on. So you had to have some variety. So we started, and that was very similar to what he'd done in the Distar as well. So we had a lot of short vowels, and then we started doing short vowels with endings, so they had hop and hope and mop and mope and the other key piece we had to have, and Wes was incredibly important on this, some kind of motivational system. And I think, you said, well, what, teachers sometimes think, oh, we don't need to do that. Yes, you do. You need that because you need to point out what's expected. We had rules for each part of the lesson, and you got points on the basis of that. Now, sometimes you got group points, and that was really hard for kids because they wanted just their individual, but they had to earn it as a group. And then they had individual points because they always had an opportunity to do their individual reading on the passage they practiced. But after we did the word attack, we'd do story reading. And in the story reading, we only gave them a sentence or two at a time because the anxiety levels of these kids was so high that they would start to make a lot of errors. So we just give them a little bit and they get successful on that. And then another kid would read. So we had, moved it around. So everybody participated and it was a group point that they got They all had to make it within certain years. And if they had parts of it they had trouble with, we'd go back and they'd have a chance to reread those again. But basically, that was the opportunity for the group to get the points. And then after that, they did what we called checkouts, and every individual student got to check out. And that was probably the key piece to really start building the motivation for kids. At first, this program, if you have real kids who are real remedial corrective readers, it's hard because you're establishing very firm rules, and you go back and correct errors when they don't want to. That was another key feature. If you make a mistake, the rule was you go back and get it right before you go on. We wanted them to know what it sounded like because they had stumbled bummed through their life, right? Guessing, looking at the teacher for cues, getting told what the word was from a neighbor. So we wanted them to be able to do it right before they got off of it. And that was hard to establish that, as well as getting everybody to respond together. But that's another key piece of why this program works. Teachers talk too much. You can see me. I could talk. The scripted lessons where it reduced all your teacher talk and maximized student participation is truly the key to what makes this program work. Because the kids are doing the talking and the acting. They're doing the responding all the time. And you're just giving them the cues. The way it evolves as the teacher teaches it, she first, she has a format of wording, we're going to say these words. First, you're going to tell me the first sound, you're going to tell me the word, whatever. Each format varies, and there's several different ones during the word attack portion. But the kids learn what is expected of them, and they learn they all have to respond. That takes a little work because they don't want to all respond, and they have to respond on signal so that you can hear them. Then after they've done it as a group, you go back and do individual checks, but everybody gets talk. And I think that's so important. That's one of the reasons I hated school. It's like, man, you'd have to wait and you'd raise your hand, no one would call on you. And here, everybody's expected to participate. And you hear an error, you go back and repeat. You don't figure out, you don't say, Susie, you made that error. Sam's
Right.
no, but you hear it, you go back till everybody gets it right, and then you move on.
Yeah.
Maximizing that participation. So those are some of the key things that really started working
Can
with
I
those kids.
can I ask you a question about the point? So you talked about it being a motivational piece. What did you see? What type of difference did you see in the students when the point started being used consistently?
They started really valuing them. They started wanting to work to get the group points for the story and for the participation on the word attack. And in the word attack, I love this part because it really made a difference. The word attack, you do all these different formats or tasks that are repetitive. They're very similar. So kids know what's expected. You're going to for what sound, what word, you give a signal, it goes through it quickly. And then there's the individual checkout on just the word attack. And this is where the rubber hits the road. Because if a kid can't read the whole line of words and they're all mixed up together, if they can't read it without an error, they don't get a point. So it's a limit, like they'll have 8 lines and they have to read 6 of them without any errors. And if they don't, then they don't get the points. And it's like, oh, well, so everybody has to pay attention and do their best. And it's not punishing, but it's accountability. So everybody has to participate to really succeed, or the whole group gets punished. And I always, when they're doing that, keep my points. If they get one, okay, you got a point. Okay. And then when they get one, oh, I got a point. There's
Yeah,
always
yeah.
this, so that's a really powerful part for that individual accountability, even in the word attack portion. And then in the story portion, they have to read with a certain error limit. And if they don't, again, they don't get their points. So everybody is held accountable and they're always participating. That makes a real change in their behavior. They've never usually had that accountability. They can slop through and the next kids answer it, and it doesn't matter. But the really powerful part that turns the kids around is the individual checkout. And that's where they get to see their progress. It doesn't happen immediately, but they start seeing how they read their little passage, which is only for a minute. They read it, and if they can't read it with less than 3 errors, they don't get their points. So it starts building in a habit of rereading and practicing, which is what these kids have never had. So they really benefit from that. And then we chart it, and they get to chart and start seeing how they're going faster and their errors are staying down and how it keeps going, and the light bulbs go on. It's just fabulous to see that. Wow, I'm getting better. And it doesn't mean, they all kind of hit it at different times. It's beautiful. It is the most powerful part. And then, of course, they get some points when they do workbook activities. It was necessary for us to add a component of a workbook as well, because when you're trying to individually check out kids, they need something when they've already checked out. Initially, the teacher checked out every student. We then later on instituted the procedure where we do paired checkouts, and there'd be the ones and the twos, and they would switch. But we know that's not as reliable because the kids are trying to catch the other kids' errors when they're remedial readers. Come on, they're going to miss them, right? So the teacher still has to go around and keep that accountability on the checkout. So it's hard, but it's so critical that they get that opportunity for checking out every day. So they need a workbook to work on and give them, checks on their comprehension as well. It started out as just one program. Ugly, God, it was ugly. And the stories, we really thought the stories were going to do all the teaching. And we had a lot of, initially, we started out with teaching the short vowels like drop and top and hot and lot and all these words. And then we started the CVCE words. So they would go hope and mope and all these other words would be introduced after that. Then they had OL, all these words. I look at these early stories. The stories were gold. Siggy could impact that, and he could use more words that he would come up with certain sound combinations than anyone could ever imagine. So the intensity, and I'm going to say this over and over, what makes this program different and probably superior to anything else is his brilliant writing. And he was a writer, but he kind of gave up the other writing. His brilliant writing using all the types of sound combinations and words he'd already introduced cumulatively, and giving a really high intensity on new ones. One of my favorite ones, in fact, I got to show you this one. A lot of kids come in, they don't know the digraph. They don't know sh and ch. And one of the first stories that I thought was so fun is the story of Chi. And the Chi is a she. She is a she, and she is a dog. She's a talking dog. Chi, the dog, got bigger and bigger every day. And then she does these things. The way the intense practice on sh and ch right there, they're never going to have trouble with that one again. And then there'll be other examples. And for instance, this is one of the versions of the program where it went off and be what, where they're doing amp, common sound groups of sounds that like amp and tamp and cramp and champ. We have tamping and a lamp, and we have a ramp, and we have so many words. They never have more troubles on that. And then when we get into the slipping and sloping and slopping and slopping, they have so many intense practice combinations that they learn those things very, very well. And they,
Yeah.
They're very successful. So yeah.
That looked very different from the version that I'm used to seeing. But were the layouts and the formats like in the teacher presentation different as they were revised? So I think you had mentioned later you guys added word attack.
We
Yeah.
did, although that was right off very soon.
Okay.
It was necessary. Basically, all of the revisions that have occurred have those same components. They had a word attack portion, story reading, checkouts, and workbook. That's always been there. The refinement has been in, I think, working on some of the stories and the sound combinations as they're introduced, but basically the stories are gold. I mean, they're so unusual. It's just so weird stories, but they work because of that practice on those things are easily confused. And there's a very high intensity use of the words when, then, what, that, these, those. So students are constantly having to focus very carefully on every word they read. And that has not changed throughout all the versions of it. I mean, I can tell you, we have the tracks. The tracks are still, basically the same. Here's the scope and sequence for like B2, and it has word attack, group reading, checkouts, workbook, and their comprehension, skills.
Yeah.
So it's consistent across. Yeah.
You've talked about earlier, you mentioned the script. You said, teachers talk too much and that impedes learning. You've talked about some of the systematic instruction. What sets corrective reading apart from other remedial approaches?
Well, I've thought a lot about that because I'm really not an expert on all the other approaches. I know, a bit about Orton Gillingham and some of the things. I mean, most of them focus on phonic elements that need to be taught specifically. And the sequence may vary, but for instance, like EA, we start out with the most common EA, which would be E. And then we're going to go to the less common, like instead, and dead. And then they get words like great, but it's sequenced so that first they got mass practice on the most common, and then gradually they're integrated to the less common. And that kind of feature, I think, occurs in most of them. We certainly spend a lot of time on teaching them the CVC and CVCE words with endings because those are things that are not often explicitly taught. And, where they say the name of the vowel if there's a silent E, and then with all the endings. And they have a lot of practice on those types of words in the program. Other things, I think, what makes it really different, the maximizing of the practice on newly introduced skills. Like I said, Ziggy could put into stories the intensity of vocabulary that I've never seen anyone else. And the other key is that this program maximizes participation from the very beginning. It's tough to get that habit set up. Hey, we don't go on till everybody's saying it and doing it right. We just go back and repeat that until it's done correctly. That's considered an error when not everybody responds. But that maximizing and that habit building of everybody participating all the time. Plus, just if you looked, and I don't have a study on this per se, but if you looked at the amount of student talk versus teacher talk in a lesson period, I would say that direct instruction programs like the corrective reading have maximized student talk versus teacher talk. In corrective, it's so valuable because the formats that you use, the teacher learns basically. There are new ones in there, Flash, this is new, but they do the same thing over and over, which allows you to be very quick with your signals. Okay, first, everybody, first word, what sound, the sounds are underlined, they know what word, say a lot of times it's focus on key elements in a word that they really, For instance, the vowels, that's what they ignore the most, or the first letter, or the endings, so they'll be focused on all those different word parts that they practice, and then they'll say the whole word. So that common format carries through, most of the programs, and they just know it. And so you can just have beep, 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 beep. You just go through that quickly. And then when they need to learn something new, they're obviously, the teacher models it, she leads them with it, and then they're tested on it. And then that's integrated at a high level. Like they have things usually introduced 3 times, and then they have it in stories. I mean, it's like everything is so carefully done. The other thing, I don't think there's a program in the world that's had the careful design where everything that's been introduced is cumulatively reviewed. We spent so many hours charting what we'd taught and where we'd reviewed it. Now it's done on the computer. Whoa, that's nice. In the olden days, all of that was done by hand, and we would check to make sure we've introduced, OL. We've got to make sure there's an OL word in every, intermittently, so they never forget that, and they never don't, have an opportunity to not review it. So that's got to be fairly unique. I wanted to say too, I just loved it. I know a wonderful woman, Margaret Goldberg, head of Reading Week or whatever. She made the comment when she was learning how to teach direct instruction, and there's no question about it. It's tough to begin with. It's hard. It's not easy. You're correcting every error. You're listening so much to all the students. You're trying to get everybody engaged. If they're not, you're treating that as an error. You're going all these things, and specific corrections are given for various errors they make. Everything is very hard at the beginning, and that's where, boy, you need coaching, you need training, you need all the support you can get. But once you get, and you see that you get the repetitive formats or a task over and over again, after a short, couple of weeks, and Margaret said it so beautifully. She said, it was just, I hope no one would see me for the first couple of weeks. And then she said, all of a sudden, I was able to really attend to what my students were doing. I had my focus on them, where in traditional curricula, the teachers are not only having to teach and watch their students, but decide and figure out what they're doing next. These lessons are set up so carefully that is already decided and done. I mean, every lesson that we tried out, we came back. I brought the feedback from the lessons errors, and we use that information to guide us for the next lesson. Everything is so structured to build that extra feedback in, and the teacher doesn't have to remember and try to figure that out all the time. And it's also, allows a teacher just to be able to enjoy the kids more. I think everybody says, oh, well, it's scripted, it's taking my language and all that away. No, it makes it more fun, because that way you really can attend and start focusing on what specific problems kids have. Partly because teachers don't really understand they can use a scripted program. It seems like, oh, that's impossible. No, you can do it very well, but you have to practice you're an actor. You got to practice those words. You got to know them automatically, and you have to have some automaticity in being able to respond when students make mistakes. That just takes practice. And if you don't get that practice early, I mean, I know the programs are set up with all that scripting that someone who doesn't know anything can come in if the group is good, and the group will help you do it. But if you're learning it for the first time and trying to teach the students how to respond, you have to have that training. You have to have that practice. And I think it's very critical to have coaching, someone that helps you through those rough spots, because every group is different. Every age. This program works with, I've used it with second graders, but the low level, because it works fine. it has all the elements that the introductory programs have, but it's third through forever. And every student's going to come with, specific needs. I had a Jamaican gentleman I taught through the whole program. He never learned initially, and he had some learning disabilities, no question about it. But he went through A and learned all the sounds, and it just built it up till he could read anything. And it was like he needed every single step, but he had to do the program perfectly, and you could not vary from it.
What would you say to new teachers that are just being introduced to programs? Let's say they're summer training in a couple of weeks, they're getting ready for the fall. What would you say to them?
Well, again, practice your lessons. Practice it with the dog or your kids or whatever you get.
Yeah.
Have some automaticity there. And you're feeling more confident. And then I think it's really important, I really think, like I said, it's valuable to be able in training sessions to look at all parts of the program, like the decoding A's emphasis on the phonemic awareness that goes away because it's not needed by most of the kids, but there'll be some that need it. The way that we introduce and practice the corrections, it varies, as you get more sophisticated through the program. The sounding out is very critical for kids with learning disability. That was my doctoral area. I mean, I just focused with kids that had a lot of problems on that. And that's essential for some kids. And others, they don't need that. I mean, they get the sound, they figured out. I think so many kids in our country right now are so disadvantaged from having COVID around and not being able to get a full year of schooling and all those days that they just needed. And so they've just got these gaps, and if we fill in the gaps, many of those kids can really fly with it. But then there are kids that with real specific learning disabilities that just need that extra practice. And so practicing your formats and knowing what types of things you can do to help various kids is really important. One of the biggest things too is that our school schedules don't match what's really needed. And teachers need to go back and work with their staffs to make sure they have the amount of time they need for the students to participate in the program. I know a lot of schools will have, 35 minutes or what, not enough time. These lessons will take at least 45. And if they don't get that and they don't complete a lesson, they don't make the progress through the program that they really need to catch up. One of the schools I worked with was a middle school that had a lot of immigrant kids. They had a lot of Mexican kids coming in, a lot of Russian kids because it was a big rural area. And they added a 0 period so that all the students who, whatever, everybody had reading during that time. And that was when they could really target those kids who didn't have the reading skills. The others got, extra things at that point, but they had to add a whole extra period in order to accommodate the needs of those kids who were way behind. That was one way. I think a lot of places do it with taking them out of, it's sad because a lot of those kids really need the electives. They need the music, they need the art, they need things that are so inviting for them to, be able to thrive. It's not fair to take that away, but they need more time and they need to finish a lesson a day. Because if you don't finish a lesson a day, you kids, if you have them rightly placed, and we have worked for years on those placement tests to really, there's still kids that'll vary, but most of all, you get them in a group, they can carry on in that group. There'll be variations and there'll be some kids that miss more time and so on, but they need to get a lesson a day and keep going. If they're able to do their checkouts, this is the guideline I think all teachers need to hear. If your students are passing their checkouts, they're keeping their errors down, and they're making those fluency gains, they should be going at a lesson a day.
What has been most rewarding seeing your programs used across decades and generations of students?
The light bulb, when they learn to read, clicks, and they just start that success when they start saying, I could do this. I could do this. It really switches, and it doesn't happen immediately. And some kids are really phobic. Um, I've had some students come in and they have so much difficulty reading more fluently. You just, it varies so much, but it's just that patient, continued practice on what they can do that makes the difference. And the thousands and thousands and thousands of kids I've seen learn to read. I guess some of the most tragic situations I've had, but it was also the right thing. I remember in Fort Worth, Texas once, and they tested all their high school students. And I walked in, and worked with students, football players, all the athletes. They were in decoding A.
Wow.
Couldn't read at all.
Yeah.
And for those, we close the door, we keep it really private, and then they start seeing how they can do it. And they've got the strategies for sounding out words and reading them accurately. And you're giving them such a life-saving tool. But at first, it's so hard because of their embarrassment and shame. And it's like, boy, that was really hard initially. And you just stick with it. I had another kid. I had a bunch of kids too. They were real, they were so turned off, middle kids, angry, really hard to deal with. And I basically, with that group, I talked to the parents. They had parents that were still intact. I'd say, okay, what's the kid like to do? Oh, he really likes to ride his motorcycle. Okay, how about we make an arrangement? You wait for me to give you the the key report on how well he's done before he gets the keys to the motorcycle. It's so empowering. It is. And you think, boy, they can work, they can, they can succeed in this world where they couldn't before.
Linda, I've really enjoyed meeting with you today and hearing more about corrective reading. I mean, it just reinforced my experience, and I'm feeling rejuvenated and excited for others that are interested in corrective reading or already know about corrective reading, have been using it, to hear your insights. Here's to the next 50 years of corrective reading. I'm excited for it to continue. And thank you everyone for watching as we celebrate 50 years of empowering students through corrective reading. Thank you, Linda, for your time.
Thank you, Elise. It's been a real pleasure.